Welcome to my lecture series about bad science in the news. In this lecture, I'll be discussing the case of vaccines and autism. Now, you may be familiar with this research paper by Andrew Wakefield and his collaborators, which was published in the medical journal The Lancet in February 1998. In this research paper, the authors made claims about the link between autism and vaccines. But later, some investigations and questions that were raised revealed that, well, maybe those claims weren't so valid, and maybe there were some conflicts of interest that should have been reported. Indeed, the research paper was retracted by the journal, and Dr. Wakefield later lost his license to practice medicine in the UK. I'd like to start by looking at what this research paper did. So the study was of 12 children with some sort of developmental disability, some developmental disorder. Most of them were diagnosed with autism. And there were a number of studies, or a lot of data collected about these children. For example, their medical history, a psychological assessment, a brain scan, a colonoscopy, so an examination of the large intestine, including a biopsy, so a sampling of tissue. There was also a lumbar puncture, where a needle was inserted in the lower spine to draw some cerebrospinal fluid for analysis. And there was also a urinalysis. Now, what the research was focusing on, at least in principle, was the relationship between autism, or developmental disorders, and gastrointestinal disease, so disease of the stomach and digestive system. There's been a lot of research looking at that, and that's what, at least on the surface, this study was interested in. But that's not exactly, or not entirely, what was reported. So the researchers reported several findings. First and foremost, there was a link or an association between vaccines and autism as reported by the parents or by the children's physicians. In the article stated that in 8 of those 12 children, the onset of behavioral problems had been linked either by the parents or by the child's physician with measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination. 5 of those 8 children had an early adverse reaction to immunization, and of all of those 8 children, the average interval from exposure to first behavioral symptoms was 6.3 days. So there were findings about the link based on what parents and doctors reported. This is called anecdotal evidence. Another finding reported, or perhaps an explanation of the first finding, is that there was a possibility of what they called vaccinal encephalitis. Encephalitis is the swelling of the brain's lining, and as you might imagine, encephalitis is related with a lot of brain disorders. They also reported that all of the children under study had some sort of gastrointestinal disease, and this was really what you would expect them to be reporting about, considering all of the measurements that were taken of these children, which I showed you on the previous slide. And based on these findings, they drew some implications about what their study means, and, well, interestingly, they only had one implication, that gastrointestinal disease is probably related to autism. And that's not an unreasonable claim to make. A lot of studies have shown essentially that. There's nothing too contentious or controversial about that claim. What was left out of the interpretation, but what was included in the findings, was the vaccine and autism link. Now, here's where the problem came up, because an investigative journalist by the name of Brian Deere wrote some articles about this vaccine autism study, and a number of these appeared in the British Medical Journal. According to one of his articles, when the Lancet paper was published in February 1998, and the scare was launched at a televised press conference, nobody was aware that Wakefield was receiving substantial personal payments from a lawyer named Richard Barr, who hoped to bring a lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers. This was the major conflict of interest that went unreported and really led to this controversy blowing up. And yeah, essentially the researchers had inserted these claims, these findings, that were somewhat incidental about the link between vaccines and autism, and that affected essentially what the implications of the study were, even though they didn't state so in their interpretation. But it did affect how the public talked about this issue. So one of the things that is critical about this linkage between vaccines and autism is what they talked about is probably, what they reported in that study is probably a spurious association. So what they reported, what they found in the study based on what the parents and physicians said, was that the vaccine happened before the onset of symptoms. Well, there's a potentially easy explanation of why that was the case. So MMR vaccines, according to the US Centers for Disease Control, are typically given at the age of 12 to 15 months. And in 2005, there was a study showing that on average, autism diagnoses happen at 3.1 years of age. That is after the MMR vaccination. And so in most cases, children with autism will have their diagnosis after they've received the MMR vaccine. Just because the MMR vaccine happened first doesn't mean it caused autism. I mean, there are a lot of things that happen to children before the age of 3.1 years. I would imagine most children who have been diagnosed with autism receive their first pair of shoes sometime between being born and becoming 3.1 years old, or before their autism diagnosis. Would it be reasonable to say that owning shoes or wearing shoes causes autism? Probably not. And in fact, there's a lot of research, a lot of research suggesting that there is no link between autism and vaccines. And what a lot of these studies have done, which presents quite the compelling case, is they look at the incidence of autism diagnoses between children who have been vaccinated and children who have not been vaccinated. If there is a link between autism and vaccines, you would expect to see a lower incidence of autism among children who have not been vaccinated. And that has not been shown in these studies. There are other ways researchers have also examined the autism vaccine link, a number of different types of designs, and there is fairly compelling evidence and fairly consistent evidence that there is no such link. So why is this a problem? I mean, if the scientific community agrees that there is no link between autism and vaccines, is it a problem? Well, I'd like to present this map of the United States, which is color-coded. I'm going to tell you what these colors mean in just a second. No matter what state you live in the United States, if you have a medical reason, if you are a parent and there is a medical reason that your child should not be vaccinated, for example, a specific vaccine might be harmful to a specific child for certain medical reasons, then it makes sense that the child should not be forced to have the vaccine. And in all the states in the United States, medical exemptions are permitted. But in a lot of states, the ones here in red, parents can exempt their children from having vaccines for religious or philosophical reasons. Philosophical reasons could be simply the personal belief that vaccines are immoral. Many other states allow exemption on the basis of religious grounds, and only 3 states allow medical exemptions only. So in the vast majority of states, parents have a lot of discretion over whether or not their children get vaccinated. And here's where the problem is. In many states, the rate of non-medical exemption, so exemptions for philosophical or religious reasons exceeds 5%. In many states, 5% of children aren't getting vaccinated, and they're getting exempted for non-medical reasons. Why is this happening? Well, it has a lot to do with the information people are receiving. I did a little search on YouTube. I searched for vaccine autism. Those were my search terms. And I sorted the results by view count. And so the video at the top is the most viewed video from that search, and then the videos that follow are in decreasing view count. And what's nice to see is the top 3 videos are critical of the anti-vaccination position, and they do a little bit to explain why that position doesn't make any sense and why there really isn't a reasonable or a good reason to believe that vaccines cause autism. That's the first 3 videos, and those are the 3 most viewed videos under those search terms, but all of the rest are presenting anti-vaccination perspectives, and a couple of them involve Jenny McCarthy, who is a celebrity, and of course celebrities have certain impact, and many of the other ones, although they don't involve celebrities, they do involve parents telling their personal stories, and very often these personal stories are relatable to other parents, and very often they are emotional, as you could imagine. A parent talking about their child's autism and their belief that it's related to a vaccine. And not only are a lot of people watching these videos, but they're talking about them. So the last video, which has almost 700,000 views, has over 7,000 comments. And some of these comments are critical of the position that vaccines cause autism, but a lot of them are concerned about the vaccine autism link and express distrust of the medical community and distrust of researchers and distrust of government. And so there's a lot of conversation happening. And this is a unique property of social media where people can watch videos and engage in discussion or debate or flaming. But this phenomenon of misinformation about the autism vaccine link isn't new. We can go back to the beginning. So in 2000, I found a news clip from, well, that's purportedly from 2000. I pulled this off YouTube, I will admit that. But there was coverage initially of this this link between autism and vaccines, and this is an early news report that includes an interview with Andrew Wakefield. Let's watch.
A controversial theory first published in the prestigious medical journal Lancet by Dr. Andrew Wakefield.
There is a great deal of evidence stacking up to suggest that the parents, their contention that their child regressed after MMR is indeed correct.
Dr. Wakefield claims to have found 170 children, including Matthew Burt, who developed autism within weeks of MMR vaccination. What's more, each of those children was also suffering from gastrointestinal problems.
And there is undoubtedly a disease in the bowel of these children.
All right, so you've got to admit, Andrew Wakefield does a good job interviewing. He's media savvy, he's clearly very intelligent, and he does something that's quite brilliant if you're trying to persuade an audience of a certain factual statement. He creates what is essentially a half-truth, because you saw he concluded with this idea that autism is related to gastrointestinal disease. And that's probably a true claim. And because he started, or because somewhere in his argument he presented a true claim, it makes it harder to reject the other claims he makes, like the claim that vaccines cause autism. Now, there was a lot of coverage early on of his study, and like I said, he's media savvy. He was very involved with the media, presenting the results of his study, and generally spreading the idea that vaccines cause autism. And then, of course, there was the retraction. He lost his license to practice medicine, and the matter was settled, right? Well, not right. There was a news report by Fox News in 2011 that introduced a potentially new controversy. Let's watch.
We have an important story to tell you about. This is a Fox exclusive. We have breaking news over the debate over autism and vaccines. It's a brand new hour of America Live. I'm Allison Camerata in for Megyn Kelly today. A group of families who have children with autism are set to announce the results of a major investigation tomorrow. The group saying that the federal government has paid multi-millions of dollars in settlements to dozens of families whose children suffered brain damage after receiving childhood vaccines. Coming up, we're going to speak with two different doctors. One, the parent of a child with autism who is planning to be at that big groundbreaking announcement tomorrow. And the other, one of our own medical aid team, here to talk about all the past studies that have found no link between vaccine and autism. It will be a fascinating segment. Stick around.
Well, that was interesting. So what we learned from this is that maybe there's some sort of conspiracy by the government to pay off parents of children whose autism was caused by vaccines. And we know about this because of what parents have said. And in fact, on this news show, one of the parents will be presenting their story. Now, as I mentioned before, stories from parents can be quite compelling, they can be relatable, they can be emotional. And whether or not the parent is trying to be persuasive, what they say is persuasive. Stories are effective. And there's the parent side of the story, which will be contrasted with some information that one of the Fox News A-team members will be presenting about the scientific evidence that there is no link between autism and vaccines. So at least they're presenting balanced information, right? It's that, yeah, there's this potential issue where the government is covering up the autism vaccine link, but then there's also all this evidence that there is no link. It's a balanced story. Turns out balanced coverage is actually a problem. So there was a study by Dixon and Clark. Oh man, I misspelled Clark. It's C-L-A-R-K-E. Accidentally added an extra E there. Too late to fix it now. Here we go. So Dixon and Clark were interested in the different ways of covering the autism vaccine link in the news. And what they did in their experiment is they presented participants with a number of different types of news stories that framed the autism vaccine issue in different ways. So first there was the anti-link. This was a story that presented statements from scientists saying there is no link between autism and vaccines. Then there was a pro-link saying that yes, from scientists, there is a link between autism and vaccines. Then there was a balanced story presenting both the anti-link and the pro-link. And then finally, a control story that was unrelated to vaccines and autism. And one of the dependent variables they measured, which is currently on the vertical axis, is participant certainty that vaccines do not cause autism. As you would expect, there was a high degree of certainty in the anti-link condition and less certainty in the pro-link condition, although those two bars weren't statistically significantly different. But then when they looked at the balanced story, it was the lowest, and it was significantly lower than the anti-link story, even though it contained some anti-link information, but it also contained some pro-link information. And that balanced story was also significantly lower than the control condition. Now, the authors said, or they suspected, that this pattern of results had something to do with perceived consensus or perceived disagreement among scientists. And so they measured another dependent variable, perception of a divide among scientists. And kind of as you might expect, there was the lowest perception of a scientific divide, or of a divide among the scientific community in the anti-link condition. It's a little bit higher in the pro-link condition, but not significantly different. It was the highest in the balanced condition. It was significantly higher than the anti-link condition. And it was also significantly higher than the control condition. So what the authors concluded is that balanced reporting creates this sense that the scientific community is in disagreement or they're uncertain, and then that affects certainty about the scientific facts. So balanced coverage is actually problematic. So here's a broad question. Why do scientists and the media allow bad science to propagate? In another one of my lectures in this series, I will be addressing that. Essentially, how does bad science make it into the public? Go ahead and check out that video. If you're interested about any of the studies I cited in this, the links are in the description. Thanks for watching.